First of all, some of the economies in the emerging markets that are major trading partners for Africa have continued to grow. I mean, China is growing and Asia continues to grow very fast. The numbers coming out of Britain yesterday were encouraging, so the rest of the world is not likely to be, and Germany has been doing pretty well, so Germany and Britain probably pull the rest of Europe out. And remember, there are countries like Turkey that continue to grow faster than any other country in the OECD, so there are pockets clearly of growth. The major challenge I see is that the growth in Africa is vulnerable because it is so dependent on other parties. And what we need to do is develop, look at the structures of African economies and see how we can look internally and exploit internal markets and be less dependent on primary exports, and that is going to hold the key.
That issue's also come to the fore here with Pascal Lamy, for instance, talking about the need to foster intra-regional trade in Africa and drawing on the example of Asia, for instance, and say just by virtue of ASEAN countries being able to trade amongst themselves, it's pushed up their GDP by 2.2% on average in Asia. Africa's got a huge infrastructure deficit when we start talking about intra-regional trading mechanisms. For the medium term, what are the options available?
Well, I listened to the conversation today and I was a bit disappointed because we're still talking about aid for infrastructure and talking about foreign donors. The truth is that you don't need aid for infrastructure. You just need to have a proper PPP environment, right policies. With the kind of infrastructure deficit that we have on the continent, the opportunities are great. I'll give you an example. Take the power infrastructure. We in the Central Bank of Nigeria own 60% of a company called AFC, the African Finance Corporation. Now that company has lent about $20 million to a commercially viable power project in Ghana. We've lent money to a power project in Cape Verde, to a power project in Kenya. We can't find a power project in Nigeria because the policy environment is not yet in place. Now, with the reforms in the power sector, what will happen is that commercially viable power projects come in, and you don't need to look for donors. People actually bring in their money because they find that they can make money filling that deficit, meeting those deficit requirements. So that's one, and we need to change our attitude towards the source of financing and think of attractive investment as opposed to aid for infrastructure. The second thing with Africa is we've got to understand that for us to have proper intra-African trade, we need to build competitive advantages locally. I mean, there's no reason for a Ghanaian to buy textiles from Nigeria if they can get cheaper textiles from China. Right. Okay, so the question is, how do we build a competitive textiles manufacturing industry in Nigeria? How do you address the power and infrastructure deficit? And how do you address the cost of production security issues? So it comes down to building a strong and virile economy. South Africa has exported a lot to the rest of Africa. You've got services, the telecoms companies. There are possibilities for manufacturers to come out of South Africa to the rest of Africa, but we now need to have more economies producing that.
Another issue that's come up extensively during this forum is the need to nurture an indigenous private sector in Africa, and again issues of capital support and financing for the private sector have risen up, but also issues like developing manufacturing concerns in Africa are issues that have also come to the fore. Is that, you know, beyond policy, there's a lot more that's needed to really support the indigenous growth of the private sector.
Well, that's true, but the truth is that the greatest deficit in Africa is a policy deficit. I mean, the reason we don't have power in Nigeria is because we didn't have the reforms moving forward when they should have moved. There are people who have for many years benefited from getting big budgets and claiming that they're going to provide power, and they never provided the power and never accounted for the budget. So they actually stopped the process of getting private investments into power. The reason you don't have a proper PPP environment is because people don't want to let go of their fat budgets. So if you fix policy, and this is policy not just around infrastructure, you've got policy around, for instance, technical and vocational education, because you need the skills for you to develop an economy. You've got an entire policy around your tariff regime and incentives. Now, the only way you can nurture industry, we've got a vibrant private sector. Many people just want to have the right environment. Take agriculture. You've got 42% of Nigeria's GDP is agric. 90% of that is primary production. All you need is a policy that actually seeks to promote the value chain, moving from primary to processing and saying what are the challenges of moving to the next stage and how do we fix those challenges, and finance will come in.
All right, just looking at the environment in which Africa is operating in at the moment, very soon will be the G20 summit in Korea, and already lots of speculation as to what's on the agenda. People concerned about the so-called currency wars and manipulation of currencies in order to bolster exports from emerging markets, for instance, concerns about the low interest rate environment in Europe and the United States, and the extent to which you can inject liquidity into those systems, and where Africa fits within that continuum. What's your assessment?
The G20 thing has happened, hasn't it? I think, well, there are a number of ways to look at it. One thing clearly is that the United States is concerned about the huge surpluses in China. My own sense is that in the medium to long term, the Chinese will recognize that it is in their own interest to look to a more domestic-led model and reduce their dependence on the US. I mean, one of the reasons China has invested so much in US treasuries is that if anything happens to the US economy, then Chinese exports suffer and the Chinese economy suffers. So it's there's this they're in an embrace of death, as it were. The US and China are intricately tied to each other. Now, the way forward for both the United States and China is for the US to reduce its borrowing and start creating a real middle class, because it's got to address the internal income distribution inequalities in America. Most people don't recognize that the US actually produces the income, but that income goes to the top 1% of the population. And therefore, the vast majority of the US middle class can only survive by borrowing. And that's why we've got this huge leverage. So you've got to have an internal policy that begins to redistribute income to a middle class and reduce the level of debt. Now, China, on the other hand, has to promote its domestic markets and have a more internally led model, and that is what will lead to a balance. I don't think it's correct for anyone to define or determine by political fiat how much surplus a country can have. I don't think Chinese would accept it. I don't think the Asians would accept it. I don't think they should. Now, for us in Africa, so long as China continues to grow, that is one market, it allows us to diversify. But I think we need to recognize that Africa itself is one big market. And if we actually fix the infrastructure and power issues and developed competitive advantage in, say, light-scale manufacturing, I'm not saying compete in high-tech nuclear physics type of things, but textiles, apparel, footwear, food processing, we could actually increase intra-African trade and be less dependent on what happens in the rest of the world.